Today's elections are honest. I have a cousin in Kentucky who believes he won an election that was stolen from him. There are rumors of all kinds that corrupt politicians can manage voting machines, can hack voting machines, and a lot of people in Georgia in particular, other places are calling for, hey, let's go back to the old paper ballot and not have these electronic voting machines which can be hacked into or can be programmed. This is going on right here in Georgia right at this minute, folk, if any of you are aware of it. That you want to go back to paper ballot. All right. A couple years ago, the people of Great Britain voted out of the European Union. It's called the Brexit vote, Britain exit, Brexit. But it's believed that they got voted out because they used paper ballots. And a lot of people got involved in counting the ballots. I mean, several people would count the ballots, and the balloting had to be fair. But it's believed that in places where they used electronic ballots, the vote was hard against Brexit. But enough places used paper ballots that the vote actually went Brexit's way, and Britain voted itself out of the market. But the vote was like something like 57% to 43%, but I believe the vote actually was higher because in places where they used electronic ballots, they voted in favor. I say that tongue in cheek, but they voted in favor of staying in. So again, we don't know for sure how true that is, but we do know a lot of people got involved in Britain in counting the ballots. Tweed once said, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Very famous saying in American politics. In other words, as long as I'm counting the votes, the vote is going to go my way. Okay, I couldn't say more about that, folks, because I know from personal experience places where we have, you can't prove it, but we have suspected things like this goes on.
What was his name?
Tweed.
What was his first name?
I don't know what his first name was. His name was.
William.
What's that?
William Cedos.
What page is that on?
That's on page 505. Yeah.
Oh, William Marcy Tweed, otherwise known as Boss Tweed. William Marcy Tweed. Yeah, page 505. Thank you. Now, to commemorate Columbus Day in 1892, now y'all know Columbus discovered America in 1492. In 1992, we had to, but by 1992, Columbus had largely fallen out of favor as being a man who was a racist and a killed a racist and a mass murderer and a racist. Practiced genocide. Each of you can decide what you believe about that. But in 1992, Columbus was fast falling out of favor, but he was highly in favor in 1892. And to commemorate Columbus Day, some people in Chicago built White City, a huge, huge city. But a lot of persons today say that the city was built in such a way that it was designed to crumble, and it was doing that within a few years just from natural weathering. In other words, it was not designed to stand. And eventually, now to make a long story short, White City was set on fire. I'm not going to write that down. White City would not be. Yes, it is. I'm sorry. Yes, it is. It was in Chicago. What happened? Eventually, the man who built it said, I wish the city would burn down. And exactly what happened. The people who were living in it at first left it. But it was supposed to be the city of the future, a city that was just shining, glistening, all white. But it was cheaply built and poorly put together, and the weather itself did a lot of damage. Then finally, a bunch of hoodlums moved in, and they began to make life really scary for the people who lived there. And one after another, the people who had lived there moved out. Then the hoodlums burned it to the ground, like the man who built it really wanted to have happen to it anyway. And White City became a thing of the past. Now, All right. I want to have one more thing to say about socialism. It was during this time that a strong socialist movement got started. A man wrote a book which I gave a speech about when I was in high school during speech class called Looking Backward. Edward Bellamy, the name. In the book, Edward Bellamy's character fell asleep and woke up and it was 2000. He happened to be able to go to the future, and the future was 2000. In the year 2000, people were interconnected by telephones, and the telephone was better. He did not envision radio, but they could listen to what we'd call radio today, but they would listen by telephone. And in the year 2000, the whole world was at peace. Everybody was happy. Everybody was healthy. It was a socialistic world. Nobody had any more than anybody else. Everybody was all equal. And he wound up, though, finding a way to get back to the 1880s. And he got back to the 1880s to try to sell his idea. And he couldn't sell it very well because the people weren't ready for it. But they looked forward to a socialistic utopia where that there would be no more poor people. Everybody would be equal. And this is what socialism promises. Essentially what socialism does is all the wealth that's created is sent to a central planning authority, and then the central planning authority redistributes that wealth equally among everyone. At this point, I wish I had some soap. I'd wash my mouth out.
Why is that?
Because of what I just had to say. Yes, which is something to me, it's ugly. Yeah, go ahead.
So you say if the rich get richer, then the poor will get richer as well.
I do believe that.
So the end point of that would be nobody would be poor?
Well, okay, there will always be poor. There always have been, and I'll tell you something. All right. Folks, okay, I know this is a state school, but you forced me to do something I really was hesitant to do. But I'm going to quote the Bible. Jesus Christ said, the poor will always be among you. That has proven to be true. Oh, now, that was quoted in the 1880s. They said, Jesus said the poor, there'd be always poor among you. The socialist said, through it on out, we know better. Okay, fast forward 140 years, 140 years, from 1880, 139 years, fast forward. There's still poor among us. There have always been poor. Socialism says that we can eliminate all poverty. Okay, it's up to each of you to decide whether it's so or not, but I want to tell you something. A clear example to me of socialism is Venezuela. Now, in Venezuela at this today, I'm talking about today, if you were in Venezuela, you would not be going to school. You might not know the land of Venezuela has a massive power blackout. There's no electricity, and people whose family have family in hospitals are concerned because there's not even electricity for the hospitals. How many ever heard this? I mean, one of you nodding your head. Most of you probably don't keep up. I didn't keep up with the news either when I was in college.
But what about Finland?
Who?
What about Finland? They're also socialist.
Now say that more.
Finland.
Oh, Finland. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that. I had a student a couple years ago who was very much in Sweden, and he was for Sweden, and I had a Finnish girl too. Some people say that Sweden, Finland, and those Scandinavian countries are doing well under socialism, but other persons saying they're about to go under, just on the verge of going under. For one thing, they've taken in more foreigners than they can handle. And right now, if Sweden, next door to Finland, got its army and navy together, and police, they could not drive them out. Sweden, next to Finland, has become the rape capital of the world, and Finland is, all right, this girl was from Finland, sat in my class, right near the front. And she said that in Finland it's so bad that the women cannot walk the streets at all. They're being assaulted and attacked. And it's not the Finnish men doing it, it's not the Swedish men doing it. It's these foreigners they've allowed in. I don't know where you're from, but this is what I've heard. And also, the government is about to go under because it simply cannot support these people who come in and contribute absolutely nothing. Now, if you know different or better, I'll be quiet and let you speak. I mean, but then again, Sweden is looked on as being a classic example of how wonderful socialism is. But I also hear the other side to it. All right, folks. What's the answer to this simple quadratic problem? Slightly wrong.
Well,
There are two answers.
positive.
One answer is, yeah, fair, you're right, positive 4. The other answer is, in other words, there's a positive side, there's a negative side. Every quadratic equation has two answers, except for some of them, the two answers are the same. Yes?
Well, to your point, and to what you're saying about socialism, I mean, here's a good example of what's happening now. We talk about money being a highlighter. It really doesn't really solve any problems. It's just a highlighter. Because if you look at it, for those who may not have a lot of money but believe in the lottery system,
Yes.
those same people who so-called hit the lottery are broke within a lifetime of winning all those millions and millions of dollars because they don't have the education or they don't have the means to do the education.
Most people who have won the lottery, it's ruined their lives. I see a head nodding. But they've now got special classes set up to train people who won the lottery on how to not lose all that money.
Right.
And when you win the lottery, you attend a class with other people, and they try to teach you how to manage that money. Most lottery winners are worse off than those of us who never played it. Again, folk, I want to remind you something. I told you the first day of class, I did not promise I would not step on your toes. And you may wonder, I'll be 70 in June. Why don't I quit? I said to a friend of mine, I feel like that you younger people are not hearing some of the things I'm saying, and you need to hear them. You might not like what I'm saying, but you need to hear what I'm saying. You need to hear the opposite point of view of what you've been hearing. And as socialism business, to me, this is because our country is heading pell-mell down the road. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
He mentioned something so interesting when it's education that is taking the lead, and you have mentioned before the example of the snakes, you know?
Yeah,
It's
the
better to have
snakes,
the
so we-
snakes than the rest, I get
Yeah.
it. But wouldn't be the example of the snakes taking all of it, giving the opportunity to those that could give education, healthcare, wouldn't that apply to something, not as socialist, but more as a fair trade for everybody? And a fair
Well-
opportunity for everybody?
Okay, here's the thing. Who can afford to build a 250-seat passenger airplane? A few of us can. But it takes, okay, some super rich man decides, I'm going to build a jet airliner that will carry people across the Atlantic. So but he has to have workers. So he hires people like you and me to work at his factory. That's how the poor get richer, because the rich people, to get done what they want done, have to hire poor people to do the work for them. If you don't let the rich get rich enough to build, and to build this type of airplane I'm talking about costs multiplied millions of dollars. To build it, you have to have a super, super rich man and let him get ahead. And then the reason he'll build it is because he can become even richer still by building that plane, and in turn he can build more plane and become richer still, and in turn he has to hire more people. So the richer the rich get, the richer we all get. Let them get their wealth.
I mean, there's rich men that actually have helped, you know, with the economy.
Well, some rich people give to charity. Andrew Carnegie built libraries. He believed his money was to, he built all kinds of libraries, and he supported education. And he hired workers.
I mean,
He hired workers, and Henry Ford made millions. He hired workers.
And those rich people understand the need of those workers and see them as
Yeah.
equals, not as above, right? Wouldn't that be
Oh,
a
yeah.
socialist mentality?
Well, I'll say this in Henry Ford's favor. Now, Henry Ford believed that if he paid more than anyone else, he could pick his workers, and Lockheed felt the same way. So they paid more than everybody else. That way they can pick their workers and keep their workers longer. I mean, to do the work to build an airplane, it costs the company thousands of dollars to train them. But they paid them higher. And with Henry Ford, I mean, he paid his workers more than anybody else, $5 a day, when the average wage was $2 a day. But he worked his workers like slaves, drove them harder than a slave driver would drive them. So he had problems with strikes. But again, not everybody likes what I'm saying. But see, the solution, the other alternative now is let the government do it. Okay, now I want to go back to the space program. When I was a kid, there was the space program all up to government. And guess what? The government ran out of money they could spare for this. And our country is having to depend on Russians to send it, to get us into the space station. Everyone, I hopefully that I keep up know this is true. Yeah, see, we're actually hiring and paying millions of dollars every time we put one of our men into the space station because we have to pay that money to the Russians. Well, the government can't afford to build a new rocket to replace our aging space shuttles. So it's now private firms, and these private firms are building rockets that they say are going to be able to go to asteroids and go to Mars and go to the moon. Better than the government can build. Because if you get the government, you've got to go through all kinds of bureaucracy and red tape. We have a private firm, the man in charge, private firm, this is what we're going to do, let's do it. This is actually going on as I speak, right now. In fact, the latest space venture splashed down yesterday. SpaceX. Fired last week, splashed down yesterday. This actually happened. Now, the most famous socialist of the time period we're talking about was a man named Eugene Debs. Now, Eugene Debs was highly involved in the railroad strikes to the point where he actually defied the court-ordered injunction to tell his men to get back to work. He refused. Eugene Debs was in prison more than once. We're going to talk about him again because later on, during World War I, he was imprisoned again by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson imprisoned people who disagreed with him just for the crime of disagreeing with him. This is a historical fact, folk. But President Harding came along, and to his credit, President Harding commuted Debs' sentence. By this time, though, Debs was an old man. But anyway, Debs pushed for socialism in America, and he was fighting for the rights of the common man, the little man, the laborer. Now, folk, all right, on a very personal note, I grew up in poverty. My dad would preach to me how that the rich would not have mercy on the poor, how the Great Depression of the 30s, which my dad grew up in, was part of, was caused by the rich not having mercy on the poor and crushing the poor. But we kids had to sit and watch while my dad made some financial decisions that were devastating. I'm not saying every decision I made has been right, but eventually, after doing some thinking about things, I came to conclusions that were quite opposite from the conclusions my dad taught me. I am not rich, but I do believe we should let the rich forge forward and get richer. As a youngster, I had a teacher when I was 9 years old who made me a space enthusiast. I'm still a space enthusiast, even though I'm almost 70. I dream sometimes of going to Mars. I dream of going to the moon. I've dreamed of being on the space shuttle. It's a dream I'll probably never get to fulfill. I'm too old. I have cholesterol issues. I have arthritis issues and a few things that way. Hopefully that doesn't show up while I'm here. But I'm getting up in years now. But I'm still a space enthusiast. The way we're going to get back into space, folks, is going to be through private enterprise and not from the government. The government will give, the government giveth, the government taketh away. Private enterprise. All right, where do they get their money? Some rich billionaire decides, I want to orbit the moon, and he'll pay these SpaceX people about $20 million, and they can afford it. So they pay $20 million. That money goes to hire better engineers. As it is, our money is going to the Russians, and guess what? The Russians can use that money to hire better engineers. Because we're having to pay about $20 million every time we send one of our astronauts to the space station. But, again, here's what some Democrats are proposing we do, folk, and this is actually, is taking all the money from anyone who's making more than maybe, who has more than a certain amount of money, maybe $20, $30 million, and taking all that money from them and redistributing among the poor folk. This actually has been proposed by some Democrats who are thinking about running for president. Have any of you heard this outside of this class beside me? Take this money, all right, one of you has. Take all this money from the rich that they don't need and redistribute among those of us who are needy. And when they do, our space program will come to an end, our airplanes will stop running, our big ships will stop running. The American Indians, before the white man came, they were pure socialists. There were no poor among them, except for they all were poor. There were no rich among them. They wouldn't tolerate the rich.
But wouldn't this socialist idea, I'm saying, maintain the balance of the overusage or treatment of people? Like, you mentioned the union,
Yeah.
you mentioned they're fighting for the rights of people. Wouldn't it be also a balance? Is it good to have them both? Would it be a balance?
That is a good point. There's such thing as a balance, provided the rich can still stay rich. Now, basically, what unions were fighting for, they call it, they do the pie. The management gets this share of the pie. The workers get this share of the pie. They said, let's give the workers a bigger share of the pie. But still, the rich could stay rich, you know. But the workers would get a bigger share of the pie. Now, there is, I mean, all right, a balance. I want to say this on my personal history. It's in the 1870 census. My great-grandfather, William Wallace Cunningham, had to quit school at 10 years old and go to work at a woolen mill in Cadiz, Ohio. I mentioned Cadiz, the home of George Armstrong Custer. He was living in Cadiz the same time Custer was. I don't know if they knew each other or not, because William Wallace Cunningham was much younger than George Armstrong Custer. But anyway, he had that woolen mill was still standing a few years ago. It had been long abandoned. 10 years old, and all of his brothers and sisters, when they turned 10, they went to school from the time they were 6 to the time they were 10. When they turned 10, they had school and went to the factory, boys and girls alike. This was one of the things that unions stopped now. This is an extreme, but this actually happened. Child labor, which I have not mentioned, but I'm mentioning it now. Child labor. And they said, well, in a farm, children help their parents on a farm. There was a difference. At least they were working, the children were working partly for themselves too. Someday the farm would be theirs. But there are times when you have to say to the rich, now, enough is enough. And for instance, how many of you have been to the big Biltmore Mansion over in North Carolina? Any of you? Okay, one of you. These big mansions were built by super rich tycoons who did not have to pay their workers a wage. They were abandoned as soon as the workers started having to collect, for this Congress passed minimum wage laws. See, the rich would say, oh, we house them, we feed them, we clothe, we house them, so we don't need to pay them money. Then the federal government said, no, you've got to pay these workers money. And the rich people had to abandon their big castles. Right here in Atlanta, there's several of these old-time, I call them castles. Callenwald is one. Up in Middletown, Ohio, there's a sword mansion. These mansions still standing that belonged to people who lived 100 years ago who did not have to pay their workers a wage. When they had to pay their workers a wage, these rich people had to live in houses a little bit nicer than mine or yours, but houses nevertheless. All right, now, anyone else? Okay, I want to say a few things about the test. It'll look like this. This will be the question. I want you to write, or if you see something like this.
You need to like match to the definition term or
Say that again.
and to match to like the term or definition.
Yeah, in other words, that's not matching. It's not matching. I thought about it, but the problem with matching is, folk, if you miss one, you miss more than one. And especially if you miss two, you miss four. If you miss three, you miss six. So at least one person was nodding your head like you know what I'm talking about. But that's the bad thing about matching. You can hardly miss one of them. So everybody, now on these tests, there's usually no curve because several people in the class know them well enough. See, the thing about multiple choice tests is you're tempted to go for wrong answers sometimes. But on these type of tests, I mean, I'll try everything. Now, it's going to be 3 points off a piece, but I'll sometimes say, oh, you left out. If you just say he was a Civil War general, I'd count off a point for that. Because I'm going to specify, you have to say he was Confederate. For chapter 15 only. I think that's the only one. But sometimes I'll just say, this answer is almost right. This is good for 2 points. Well, this answer is not quite good, but I'll give him 1 point for this. Now, let me tell you something. If you leave it completely blank, I can only count off 3 points. So try to give something of an answer. And if you've studied what I've written on a board, you'll probably do pretty well. All right, now, to go over some of the stuff I really think that I might need to remind you
What are
of.
the kind of generals or Union officers were called?
He went to become a college president, yes. But that's not what he's remembered for. Let's see. Be sure you know who Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens were. Charles Sumner. These two men opposed President Andrew Johnson, saying Congress should reconstruct the Union and not the President. The fact of the matter is, we don't know who should have reconstructed the Union. That was not spelled out in the Constitution. Now, okay, supposing you get a question, I mean, it's a different one, you get different one. What if you see this? Some of you will. Probably about a third of you. How would you answer that?
Deed with right to vote.
Not quite. I would count off a point for that.
Whatever.
That's close, though. The 14th Amendment.
What was that about
You write down what the amendment did.
The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment made them citizens. The 15th gave right to. Now, if you'd have put down this amendment gave right to, I'd count off at least a point for that. It's close because you're close. See, you're close. Yeah. But anyway, the three amendments were passed right there, close together. The 13th was passed before Lincoln died. Then the 14th, the Southern states had to ratify this amendment in order to be admitted back into the Union. That was a condition. Made them citizens. Then Amendment 15 was passed a short time later after they were all back in. Gave them the right to vote, even though the 15th Amendment was passed when most of your Southern men could not vote. They had borne arms against the Union. Only people who had not borne arms against the Union were allowed to vote. And that meant a lot of former slaves voted. There were people who had not joined the army voted. But persons who had fought in the war. So the 15th Amendment was passed by people in the South who could not, passed by people who were allowed to vote. Yes?
Quick question. You said that Lee was the Confederate general
Yes.
of the
Main army, the main army, yeah.
So-
Actually, it was over all the Southern armies. Yeah.
So who was the general over the northern, well, the United
I'm glad you asked that. It was several. First, it was Scott, but Scott was old. Then at one point it was McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, and finally Grant. Well, they went through one as the Union Army lost battle after battle after battle, and they had McClellan who simply would not move, and they had problems one after another. But they kept replacing their generals. But they finally, when they got Grant, they won the war with him. I don't believe they'd ever won the war with McClellan. The other men meant well. There was Pope, Beauregard, Burnside, among others. They had several whom they made head of the Army of the Potomac. But, with Meade, he remained in the Army of the Potomac till the war ended. But Grant was promoted over top of him. But he remained the Army of the Potomac's permanent commander. And one of the criticisms made against Lee is that Lee was general over all the other generals, but he paid no attention to the West. He only fought for Virginia, and he was supposed to be fighting for the whole Confederacy. and he neglected the West, and the West victories by the Union in the West cost the South. And a lot of the blame goes to General Lee. Another thing I don't think I mentioned, folks,